The clock on my 560 SEC recently started to run slowly and has now stopped. It's quite a common problem with capacitors on these. They age and then they need replacing. So I'm going to try and take the instrument module out and then change the clock. Well, change the capacitors in the clock anyway. So these are the tools I've got for doing it. The instrument module is just pushed into place, so it doesn't actually, there's nothing that holds it in other than these clips down the side. So if we push this in down the side, then we should be able to use it to pull the module out. So I'm just going to insert these down both sides. So you just push in carefully down the side of the instruments and then rotate, and then they should grip and be able to pull it out. So I'll just put the phone down and try and pull that out. Right, so that's pulled the instrument cluster out. Now on the back of here there are a few different connectors, so I'm just going to undo the connectors as I go along until I can remove the instruments. Remove the various electrical connectors, and they're basically all different across the back of the car, across the back of the instruments, so it's not too hard to figure out where they go. There are two bulbs which are on here, but these two are both numbered 4 and 5. That's counting from the right hand side. So where it goes into the back of the instrument cluster, it's the 4th and 5th in from the edge there. In fact, they're numbered on the back there as well. So now that the instruments are out, I need to dismantle it to get to the clock module, which is somewhere behind there. You can see I've now got the instruments out of the car. If we look on the rear of the instruments, the clock cluster is over this side. But the first thing I've got to do is to remove this plastic section here. So I need to remove these 4 screws around here which hold this cover on. So that's the first things I'm going to do. So there's 4 screws removed. There's a wire, just clips in there for a bulb. I'll just take that out of the way. Looks like I also need to remove this cover at the bottom. Just take that off. All these screws are the same length so far, so it's easy to find where they go putting them back. Okay, so that's the speedo module removed. 2 pieces of plastic came out with it, so I'll just put these back in place so that they don't get lost. I'm just going to put that unit on one side. So now I can move on to the clock module, which is this unit here. Okay, so that's the clock module removed. I can see on here electrolytic capacitors down here. So these are the capacitors I'm going to have to get at to change. So to get at those, I'm going to have to remove the clock module from the base. So here we see the clock module. So I'm just going to undo the screws on the back. So I'm just going to reposition the camera so you can see what we're doing for that. Now I'm going to remove the clock assembly from this plate. Firstly, I have to remove these 3 screws on the front. So these aren't very tight, but I'm being careful to use a screwdriver which is just the right size for it, because these screw heads are visible, so when they're in the car you really don't want them looking all chewed up, so just be very careful with it. So that faceplate is now loose. So turning to the other side, there are 2 screws which hold the clock mechanism in, I believe. So these 2 down here. Let's remove these 2. And then a further 3 go here for holding the odometer in place. These are considerably tighter than the screws on the front. I'm just using my fingers to hold it in place from the front whilst I do that. So now if I get my fingers around the back, there's also a on the back here there is a little solder tab there that needs to be unsoldered before the clock can be removed. So with all the screws out, that's the only thing that's holding it in. So I'm just going to go out and desolder that, so the clock should then be able to come out. That removed. With the solder tab removed, I can now get to the clock mechanism. So I can see here is the capacitor. There's only one electrolytic capacitor in there. So I can get underneath it, so I'm now going to desolder that, remove the capacitor, and then I shall find a new one to fit. This is the original capacitor which came out. It's 100 microfarad 16 volt capacitor, and it's got a 5mm lead spacing on the bottom, which is important. So I went online and I ordered some replacement ones which said they were 5mm lead spacing, and this is what's arrived. And if you look at the actual capacitors, you see that the lead spacing is 5mm, but that's because they've been bent to make them 5mm apart. They're actually much closer on the capacitor itself, so I didn't really want to use those. But I had a look around some spares that I'd got, and I found these 2 capacitors here, which are 100 microfarad 50 volts. Doesn't matter if they're higher voltage rating, so they're fine, and they are a 5mm spacing. So assuming that they fit onto the board, I'll be using one of those. So I'm going to try and solder that onto the clock module now. Here you can see where I fitted the capacitor. It's important to make sure the polarity is correct. There's usually a negative sign on the capacitor which needs to go on this side. So now that that's fitted, I can refit the clock mechanism and the face. So I'm just going to start off by loosely inserting these 3 screws on the front, very small screws. I'm doing my best not to touch the front of the dials because I don't want any fingerprints on them. I'm not going to do this up tight yet, I'm just inserting them into the holes, and then I'll knit them up when I've got the screws in on the back. These are not fitted very tightly anyway, they're only going quite loosely. So that's those all fitted but not tightened up. So now I'm just going to flip it over and put the screws in for the rev counter and for the clock. So I just hold that in place whilst I flip it over. So on here there are the three screws which go in here. The screwdriver's a little bit big for this. I'd use the smaller one. I've also redone this solder blob on here. That had to be redone when I refitted the clock mechanism before I put the screws in. That's important. And then there are these two self-tapping screws for the clock mechanism. As always with self-tapping screws, I wind them out first to find the thread, because you don't want them finding a new thread every time they go in. You want them to find the original thread that they were fitted in. So it's important to wind them backwards to find the thread first, then wind them in. So they should go in relatively easily, like that. That's those two fitted. So then returning to the fronts, just a quick check to make sure there's good clearance on all of the hands, and then I'll just make sure the face is nicely centered, and then I'll just nip these screws up. So these are not done very tightly anyway. And then I'll just check for fitment of the clock setting mechanism, which is here. So if I push in there, you can see that is correctly moving the clock hands. Okay, so now this unit has to go back into the main instrument binnacle here. So this module will fit into here. I'll just drop a couple of screws in. And then the speedometer goes into the middle. Now this has the plastic pieces on here, which come out easily. So to make sure they don't drop out when I fit it in, I'm going to drop the instrument binnacle onto that. So I'll hold that flat. Oh, hold that flat and then push that into place. That's it. Thank you, assistant.
You're welcome. Do I get extra pay?
And then there's also the external temperature module, which slides into there. And then all that remains to do is to refit these screws onto here. So again, self-tapping one, so I'm just winding them out first before I wind them in. You can usually feel when you're putting a self-tapping screw in whether it's going into the original holes or not. If it doesn't go in easily, then it needs to be wound out again. And two more across the top. These. This ball came out of here, so just flip it over and check it. You can see it's now all back together and that's ready to be fitted back into the car. with the instruments put back together, it's now time to put them back in the car. So refitting, as with so many car procedures, is the opposite of removal. So I'm just going to put all the various electrical connectors into the back of the instruments, and then I'll show you how to push them back into place. All the connectors are different. The two bulbs are numbered 4 and 5, so they're numbered for how they go in from the right hand side. So they're all quite easy to do. So I shall start with the longest connectors first, and then work my way through to the shorter ones. All of the electrical connectors are now in place on the back, and all the cables are out of the way underneath. So all that remains is to push the instruments back into place now. So just line it up straight with the binnacle, and then it just slides back into place. So I'll just use both hands to push it in firmly. That's basically it. Just refit the instruments like that. So it's just sliding in there. It doesn't take a great deal of force, so just push it firmly in on both sides until it's evenly in. And there, that's it, job finished. Reconnect the battery and away you go. I'm not going to reconnect the battery straight away on this because I'm currently doing some other work. So I shall reconnect it when I've finished the other jobs that I'm doing and test it. Although I have actually already tested it on the bench. I applied 12 volts to the back of it to make sure that it makes a noise, so I know the clock mechanism is working. So I'll just test it when I've finished doing my other jobs.